Like this during my conference.
All right, folks, so it's 11:30, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for being here today. So this is our second official presentation of the Proseminar series here in the Department of Anthropology at UNLV. We have a very special guest here today joining us, as you can all see through the magic of the interwebs. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Samantha Yaussy, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, coming to us today from James Madison University. Prior to taking on this position in 2023, Dr. Yaussy also served as a temporary assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at Utah State University and a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology in our dreaded neighbors to the north, University of Nevada, Reno. So all of your side comments and things of that nature. We can talk about that during the Q&A portion. Dr. Yaussy also completed their PhD in anthropology in 2019 at the University of South Carolina. Their research, both graduate and ongoing research, intersects with the fields of bioarchaeology, paleoepidemiology, and paleopathology, where they use intersectional analysis and perspectives to inform the study of life and death in the past. This work has received notice in publications, peer-reviewed journals, including the American Journal of Biological Anthropology, Bioarchaeology International, and the International Journal of Paleoanthropology. As you might suspect, this work has also received accolades from different organizations, going back to their doctoral dissertation work from the National Science Foundation, where they received a Dissertation Research Improvement Grant in 2017. And more recently, they're also the recipient of the COG Professional Development Grant from the American Association of Biological Anthropology in 2021. The talk today is titled Intersectionality and Industrialization, Exploring Frailty and Identity in 18th and 19th Century England. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Samantha Yaussy.
Hello, thank you, and good morning to everyone there. Almost afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak as part of this series. I'm delighted to be here. Today, I would like to introduce my recent research and kind of situate it within some of the larger discourses that are taking place within bioarchaeology and within adjacent disciplines that are interested in understanding this, some of the biocultural relationships that exist between health outcomes and the expression of identity. And that's both today and in the past. So we're going to start pretty broadly here. So my research uses human skeletal remains to study patterns of health and risks of mortality in past populations, a pursuit which is often called paleoepidemiology. So like epidemiologists studying health and disease in living populations, paleoepidemiologists are interested in uncovering patterns of morbidity and mortality within populations or population subsets, as well as the effects of social and biological variables on survivorship and health outcomes. Now, the main difference, of course, is that we are asking these questions of past populations. So our data largely come from human skeletal remains. Now, as the bioarchaeologists in the room likely already know, paleoepidemiological and paleopathological studies really have to contend with a great deal of limitations and biases, especially those associated with the osteological paradox. So if anyone has read the osteological paradox, you know that most of those issues are kind of summed up as demographic non-stationarity, hidden heterogeneity and frailty, selective mortality, and differentiating what we would call good health or resilience from poor health and frailty. And usually we're using non-specific skeletal lesions or skeletal indicators to try and tackle those problems. Now, those are all valid concerns, and I am very happy to discuss them in greater detail after this talk. If anyone is interested in how those factors kind of affect paleoepidemiological work, or in contrast, if someone would like to discuss whether we should just get rid of the field entirely because it's simply too flawed to be effective, that point is open to debate. But one of the main concerns I wanted to raise today is the potential for us to oversimplify patterns of health and disease and frailty in the past, or in short, kind of ignore some of these complex, multifactorial sources of morbidity and mortality risk in the past. So to have that discussion, I need to introduce the theoretical perspective that I engage in my research, that is intersectionality. So intersectionality has its roots in Black feminist scholarship and activism, and is most often attributed to legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, although the roots of the concept can really be traced back at least another 170 years. So intersectionality refers to the interactions between various categories of social difference and identity, things like race, class, sex, age, sexual orientation, ability status, disease status, and so on and so forth. So intersectionality recognizes that individuals do not have just one single social identity, but rather they have multiple kind of overlapping identities and simultaneously are going to experience multiple social statuses. Then to make matters a little more complicated, there are also structural factors and forms of systemic oppression, things like racism, classism, sexism, and ageism that are intersecting with and influencing all of these individual level identities. So, studies of intersectionality examine the shaping of and outcomes of these interactions in terms of power relations and social inequalities, and then their consequences with respect to measurable factors, things like physical and mental health, access to material resources, employment and career opportunities, and so on and so forth. So in other words, it's this simultaneous interaction of all of these identities and structural forces that affects the health outcomes and disparities that we see in populations both today and in the past. If we overlook the mutually constitutive aspects of these identities and statuses and processes, we have a pretty good chance of incorrectly identifying patterns of frailty and mortality in the populations that we study. And if recent publication trends are any indication, the utility of an intersectional perspective has been recognized by a number of different scholars in the discipline. So for example, a series of studies by Newton and colleagues provide examples of how bioarchaeologists might approach the issue of detecting systems of power in past populations using multiple lines of evidence from the archaeological record. So in the particular paper that I've posted up here, the authors argue that variation in mortuary artifacts, strontium isotope values, and cranial trauma between two cemetery populations from northern Chile reveals how structural level inequalities manifested in the daily experiences and differential access to trade and exchange networks available to certain communities during the temporal period they studied. To summarize all of this, these studies illustrate a kind of general inclination on behalf of bioarchaeologists to incorporate nuanced understandings of the intersections of social identities and forms of systemic oppression in our studies of lived experience, health, and disease in the past. And in addition to all of these that I've listed up here who explicitly engage intersectionality, there are many more bioarchaeologists who have not explicitly applied intersectionality in their research designs, findings, or interpretations, but their work still clearly demonstrates a very vested interest in understanding how multiple different intersecting identities, rather than these distinct, independently operating identities, are affecting and are affected by the lived experiences of individuals and groups in the past. So today I am going to use my own research as an example of how we might relatively painlessly integrate this theoretical perspective into paleoepidemiological and, more broadly, bioarchaeological studies. So, in line with an intersectional research framework, one of the primary goals of my research is to understand if multiple categories of identity and marginalization acted in concert to affect patterns of health and mortality in different subsets of past populations. The population of interest in this particular case comes from 18th and 19th century England, which is when the country was undergoing the process of industrialization. Now, prior to industrialization, much of England's population lived in rural settings, and households produced and consumed in local markets. However, between 1751 and 1851, very roughly speaking here, England experienced a substantial increase in population size, particularly in urban areas. This dramatic population growth provided the labor force that fueled industrialization, but it also resulted in urban crowding and some inadequately regulated, unsanitary living conditions that perpetuated respiratory, gastrointestinal, and metabolic diseases, which were then kind of further exacerbated by smoke and other environmental pollutants being produced by those urban factories. Height and weight records are frequently used by historians and anthropologists alike as proxies for health, given that disease and inadequate nutrition during the developmental period can actually permanently stunt growth. So, analyses of height and weight data from the industrial period have been very useful to us, and they suggest that adverse health outcomes associated with industrialization and urbanization were disproportionately borne by marginalized groups, such as working class women and children. For example, historians have long suggested that declines in the heights and weights of working class women may have been related to their declining economic importance within the household and the larger economy. In the textile and clothing making industries, for instance, many of the tasks that were typically given to women, such as spinning, gradually kind of disappeared into factories as industrialization progressed. And even when they obtained positions within factories or completed tasks like seaming or finishing at home, women were primarily given low-wage, unskilled positions, while better-paying jobs as clerks, overseers, and managers were given almost exclusively to men. What's important here is that these workplace transitions were then reinforced by some changing ideologies at the cultural level. Middle-class women were not expected to hold jobs at all. And working class women were expected to only contribute to the household income as factory workers or domestic servants up until marriage. So because of this assumption that women would exit the workforce when they married, skills were considered unnecessary for young female workers, and their wages were often substantially lower than those of men, who presumably needed to earn enough to support the entire family. However, despite the usefulness of historical data to explore patterns of health in the past, scholars have long recognized the biases of documentary sources. So, for example, studies of historical data are often biased towards potentially unrepresentative segments of the working class for whom data are conveniently available. So, groups like agricultural laborers, convicts, and military recruits are frequently selected. And you might notice that most of the individuals in those groups would have been adult males. So as a result, these documentary sources that we're relying very heavily on, they offer relatively little information on the experiences of other English individuals, such as the middle class or working class women and children. Additionally, although data on industrialization era mortality are available from other historical sources, so for example, the London Bills of Mortality started recording causes of death as early as the 17th century, we find that the descriptions in some of these sources are often wildly inaccurate or vague, and they do not provide an adequate description of the health of the living population from which the deceased come. Therefore, it's other sources of evidence, such as the human skeletal remains that can be incorporated into bioarchaeological studies, that really offer us an opportunity to explore some of these lost voices in greater detail and really broaden our understandings of life and health in the past. So the data I used in my analyses come from 4 skeletal collections in England that are dated to the 18th and 19th centuries. Here I really focused on skeletal samples that represented the socioeconomic divisions that existed in England during this period. So that is, I chose samples that I could pretty confidently characterize as either lower status or higher status. So in doing so, the skeletal samples that I used were ideal for investigating some of these status-based differences in frailty and mortality that were developing during the industrial period, as well as the intersections between biologically and socially generated identities that likely played a major role in influencing those mortality patterns. So to talk a little more about those collections, 3 of the skeletal collections that I worked with, so the Coach Lane collection, the St. Peter's collection from Wolverhampton, and the New Bunhill Fields collection, they are all comprised of working class individuals. So this means they were of relatively low socioeconomic status. In my analyses, I compared these 3 lower status samples to a higher status skeletal sample, which is known as St. Bride's Fleet Street. In each of these samples, I estimated age at death for individuals, for adults particularly, using a method called transition analysis. And then I also estimated the biological sex of all adult individuals in my samples using sexually dimorphic features of the skull and pelvis, which presumably reflect varying levels of gonadal hormones. So in my study of industrialization in England, I assessed patterns of physiological frailty by examining several different skeletal indicators of stress, including but not limited to craniofacial fluctuating asymmetry, orbitalia, linear enamel hypoplasia, and periosteal new bone formation. So in general, each of these skeletal indicators is believed to be associated with frailty. In paleoepidemiology, frailty is most often defined as the differential susceptibility to disease and death that exists among different members of a population. In other words, I specifically selected skeletal indicators that have been linked to a person's age-standardized risk of death in paleoepidemiological or paleopathological scholarship. However, for the sake of time and for the sake of everyone's sanity, we are just going to focus on craniofacial fluctuating asymmetry today. So to tell you a little more about asymmetry, interest in fluctuating asymmetry stems from the assumption that corresponding structures on the left and right side of a bilaterally symmetrical organism are under the control of the same genome. And thus, the right and left sides should produce identical copies of the target phenotype that has been specified by the genome. However, bouts of disease, malnutrition, and other physiological disruptions can produce minor variations in the developmental processes occurring at the molecular level, ultimately generating some subtle deviations from symmetry in those developing tissues and organs. As a result, fluctuating asymmetry can be used by researchers who are interested in the sources or effects of environmental perturbations or physiological stressors during development. So, for example, studies of fluctuating asymmetry in humans and animals have documented the links between increased fluctuating asymmetry and a variety of different stressors, such as environmental pollutants and toxins, extreme temperatures, maternal substance abuse, and childhood dietary quality. Importantly, studies of fluctuating asymmetry in human populations have also examined how levels of fluctuating asymmetry differ among socioeconomic status groups or within a single population over time. And this really demonstrates how cultural transitions and social sources of environmental variability affect development and health outcomes in a variety of different contexts. So in sum, fluctuating asymmetry in the face and skull is another skeletal indicator that could provide insight into the embodied experiences of various identity groups in the past. Quickly, before we move on to results, I wanted to briefly discuss analytical approaches, because how we approach and analyze our data is relevant in intersectional studies, especially those using quantitative data. So specifically, I should mention that quantitative intersectional studies of health in living populations have already revealed that analytical approaches that focus on a single category of identity or difference will inevitably overlook or obfuscate the effects of multiple marginalizations. So when we design our research projects, we need to recognize that groups in the middle of the social spectrum who exhibit different combinations of social advantage or disadvantage. So things like high status women or low status men, they might experience different health outcomes from individuals who are multiply advantaged or individuals who are multiply disadvantaged. So quantitative studies in particular might consider methods that are capable of evaluating the effects of multiple independent variables and the emergent effects that exist when two or more of those variables interact. Luckily, that sounds scarier than it actually is. Many of the analytical methods that are being employed in intersectional studies by epidemiologists and public health scholars working with living populations, they're all already in use in bioarchaeology as well. So for example, a good 2- or 3-way analysis of variance works. This is actually how I analyzed the craniofacial fluctuating asymmetry data in my study. Multiple regression is another great option. A third option is hierarchical log linear analysis. This is actually the method that I used to examine the associations among age, sex, status, and several of the remaining skeletal indicators that I studied. And then in addition to these quantitative methods, we could examine specific intersectional domains or population subsets and compare their health outcomes with the health outcomes of other groups of people who have other combinations of identities. So following that line of inquiry, I applied hazards analysis to specific subsets of the English population to consider how the risks of death varied among different intersectional domains or positions. So as a result, I could compare the experiences of high status men and low status women and kind of every position in between. So on that note, I also want to clarify that these are not the only ways to consider intersectionality in a bioarchaeological study. Intersectional studies of living populations, as well as many of the intersectional studies that have been produced in bioarchaeology to date, they have all been conducted through qualitative analysis and have produced some incredible narratives highlighting the experiences and health outcomes of individuals who occupy particular intersectional positions. These are just some of the few examples I can provide from my own research. So that is the source of the limitation there, rather than the limitation of the approach itself. Okay. So that being said, let's take a look at the fluctuating asymmetry results. So the results of the three-way analysis of variance that I performed suggested that socioeconomic status and craniofacial fluctuating asymmetry were independently associated with age at death. Specifically, the results indicated that low status was associated with earlier age at death. You can see that in the graph on the left. And likewise, high levels of fluctuating asymmetry were also associated with earlier ages at death. And that's what you're seeing in the graph on the right. In general, these results are not incredibly surprising. For instance, it's no great surprise that higher status conveys access to resources that can help prolong a person's lifespan, whereas low status and marginalization expose a person to a variety of risks and hazards that are capable of drastically reducing longevity. Likewise, the relationship between high levels of fluctuating asymmetry and earlier ages at death is also not especially surprising. Previous bioarchaeological research has indicated a connection between skeletal indicators of stress during development and younger ages at death in adults from a variety of temporal periods and cultural contexts. Indeed, in the 18th and 19th centuries, in England, they were just rife with opportunities for stress during that developmental period. The rise of industry produced a whole host of new environmental hazards, including exposure to pollution and toxins, urban crowding, unsanitary living and working conditions, and heightened risk of disease. The health hazards to young individuals may have been especially pronounced in urban centers that specialized in mining, shipping, and factory labor, places like London, North Shields, and Wolverhampton, which is where those lower status skeletal samples that I used in my study are coming from. So for instance, rickets. This is a skeletal disorder that is caused by lack of vitamin D, calcium, or phosphate. Rickets was incredibly common in industrial cities, particularly in some of England's mining centers, in part because the coal smoke and air pollution from factories and mines drastically reduced sunlight exposure, and sunlight exposure is necessary for vitamin D synthesis and proper bone growth. But You're probably looking at these graphs, you're saying these are just, one-way relationships, right? So what about intersectionality, right? Did my analyses reveal any statistically significant relationships among craniofacial fluctuating asymmetry, socioeconomic status, sex, and age at death? And the short answer is no. There were no significant 2- or 3-way interactions detected in any of these analyses, which may suggest that the intersection of marginalized identities did not affect risk of death in industrial era England. But bear with me for a moment. Please don't pack up and leave just yet, because I contend that the lack of statistical significance in my analyses was the product of relatively small sample sizes, which is a very common problem in bioarchaeology. And there are still interesting patterns in the data beyond statistical significance. Particularly when the mean ages at death for all intersectional groups are evaluated for trends beyond those identified by statistical significance. We start to notice that multiply marginalized individuals, which here would be your females of low status with high levels of fluctuating asymmetry. Those individuals have the lowest mean age at death compared to all other intersectional groups. The next lowest values are found in individuals who exhibit a mix of marginalized and privileged identities, including males of low status with high levels of fluctuating asymmetry, and females of low status with low levels of fluctuating asymmetry. In contrast, the multiply privileged individuals, so that's males of high status with low levels of fluctuating asymmetry, those individuals exhibit the absolute highest mean ages at death. So though not identified as statistically significant, these results suggest an intersectional trend in which individuals who embodied multiple marginalized identities, things like low status, female sex, and a stressful childhood indicated by high levels of fluctuating asymmetry, they died at younger ages on average compared to those multiply privileged individuals. Importantly, these findings are consistent with the findings of other bioarchaeological studies that have either implicitly or explicitly engaged intersectionality in their investigations of patterns of health and frailty in industrializing England. For example, Mant and colleagues, they describe a series of accidental fractures in an individual whose body was unclaimed at the Royal London Hospital. And they argue that the patterns of trauma observed in this individual reflect the complex intersection of multiple marginalized identities and forces of structural oppression that were operating in 19th century London. So the authors emphasize how macro-level forms of oppression, such as the Poor Law legislation that was enacted in 1834, these macro-level forms of oppression exerted a particularly pronounced negative impact on older women in England by severely limiting access to poor relief in their immediate local area. Simultaneously, healthcare access for poor women in general would have been restricted by affordability, geographic distance, and many of the social stigmas against impoverished individuals who were largely considered undeserving or unworthy of treatment in the voluntary general hospitals of London. Therefore, these studies, even ones that did not capture that elusive p-value of 0.05, even in those studies, we are still identifying intersectional relationships that are worthy of consideration and discussion. In the next part of my research, I used hazards analysis to consider how social factors might have influenced the risks of mortality experienced by different portions of the population. So in one set of analyses, I explored whether socioeconomic status influenced risk of death by modeling status as a covariate affecting the Seiler model of mortality. In another set of analyses, I considered whether dichotomized estimates of biological sex influenced risk of death among adults by modeling sex as a covariate affecting the Gompertz model of mortality. In the analyses with socioeconomic status as a covariate, my results were consistent with the results of my analyses of craniofacial fluctuating asymmetry. So, not to beat a dead horse here, but the individuals of low socioeconomic status were at increased risk of death compared to their peers in the higher socioeconomic status group, because individuals of low status were regularly exposed to a variety of different hazards, including appalling living conditions, dangerous occupations like mining, and increased likelihoods of developing respiratory, gastrointestinal, and metabolic diseases. But the second set of analyses, the ones with biological sex as a covariate, suggested that the relationship between socioeconomic status and mortality was not all that straightforward. And in accordance with intersectionality, the risks and benefits associated with different levels of socioeconomic status were not evenly distributed among members of the population. So particularly, these analyses suggested that sex significantly influenced risk of death, particularly in the high socioeconomic status group, with high socioeconomic status males at reduced risk of death compared to high socioeconomic status females. So in other words, something was putting even the wealthiest females at risk of death. Now, although there is some evidence from living populations that biological sex can influence risk of death, there is also a great deal of evidence that gendered behaviors and sexism at the structural level are going to be influencing mortality patterns as well. And using rich descriptions of the past recorded in historical texts, we can identify some of the risks that might have concentrated at the intersection of gender and class, and therefore primarily affected high status women. So the question is, what did these well-to-do ladies have to fear? I will tell you. Classically trained physicians, wine, and the color green, which sounds a little odd, right? That's a bit bizarre. So let me explain. We'll start with those pesky physicians. Okay. So during the industrial period, women from the lower socioeconomic strata were attended by midwives during childbirth because they were typically more affordable than medically trained doctors. Interestingly, those affordable midwives often had decades of experience with pregnancy and childbirth. So that meant they were relatively patient and they were less likely to needlessly intervene in a complicated pregnancy. But physicians at the time were not especially interested in small matters like women's health, meaning they had relatively little experience with lengthy or complicated pregnancies. As a result, those classically trained physicians were incredibly impatient, and they were highly likely to intervene in the birth process using forceps. And the use of properly or improperly sanitized forceps greatly increased the risk of infection and maternal mortality among high status women who had paid for the supposed expertise of a physician. Ouch. So let's move on to wine. Specifically, high status women could afford to regularly drink port and other fortified wines that were being imported from Spain and Portugal during this time period. Unfortunately, these really expensive wines are now known to have had inconceivably high concentrations of lead in them. It was not known at the time, of course, but lead poisoning can lead to anemia, brain damage, convulsions, a coma, and even death if it is left untreated. Now, of course, lead poisoning was a risk for anyone who drank the wine, but it was particularly concerning for pregnant individuals, as anemia associated with lead poisoning can exacerbate the already high iron demands of pregnancy. So as a result, the ability to afford and regularly consume fancy wines may have further increased the risks of mortality in women of high status relative to men of high status or women of low status. And then finally, let's talk about the color green. The color green was a risk that might have been particularly dangerous for women of high status. In the latter half of the 18th century, a pigment known as Scheele's green was developed by Swedish chemist Carl Scheele, and it was soon the most desired color in English households. Everybody wanted this color. This pigment was added to wallpaper, soap, paint, clothing, medicine, candy, and just about every other product that you can think of. And anyone who could afford it was just bedazzling themselves in green. There was only one problem here. Scheele's green was loaded with arsenic. So today, we know the dangers of arsenic are dose dependent. So a person of low socioeconomic status who was unable to afford large quantities of fashionable green products was at reduced risk. Likewise, if your household is covered floor to ceiling in green wallpaper, your health will improve if you leave the house on a regular basis. Only one problem there, as I mentioned towards the beginning of my talk, shifting ideologies at the time meant that women of the middle and upper classes were discouraged from seeking employment outside the household. Instead, they were meant to remain home and tend to the household. So, unlike men of high status who could escape their arsenic-laden homes each day when they went to work, women of high status were inundated with this poison, and they were more likely to experience the negative health outcomes that come from prolonged exposure, including premature death. Not a very uplifting talk, I apologize. So to conclude this, the overarching goal of this project was to integrate intersectionality into bioarchaeological research as a theoretical perspective or a research framework. My research thus far has suggested that skeletal indicators of stress are associated with social and biological factors, both separately and in conjunction with each other, highlighting the potential for health to vary along multiple axes of identity in ways that might be obscured by some of our traditional approaches. In this case, we can connect data obtained from skeletonized individuals with social identities at the individual level, as well as larger structural inequalities that were developing during the industrial period in England. Likewise, we can see how the risks of mortality and age at death varied across intersectional domains. And we can demonstrate using bioarchaeological and historical data that a single axis of identity is not sufficient to explain how the risks of death varied in industrializing England. So ultimately, what I want to argue is that bioarchaeology is uniquely situated to contribute to interdisciplinary discussions about how cultural context impacts intersectional relationships and related health outcomes. And I think that future bioarchaeological studies could provide a great deal of temporal depth to conversations about the effects of a variety of intersecting identity categories. We can cover everything from socioeconomic status to age, to sex, to migrant status, to disease status, to ability status, religion, indigeneity, and so many other important categories in the past. So with my last minute or so here, I wanted to again thank everyone for coming. I'm really delighted to be here. And I also wanted to acknowledge some of the funding sources that made my research possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yaussy, both for the great talk, but also being so mindful of the time, because we have plenty of time now for questions and answers for the Q&A portion of it. Apologies that you can't see everybody in the room, but we had a little over 20 people in the room, so we got a fair amount of folks in here. So if anybody would like to start us off with a question or a comment. Yes.
So, Dr. Yaussy, what are your thoughts on p-values?
Pointed question, Dr. Boyd. I think p-values have their place. I think they can be useful as indicators of when we are potentially seeing trends in our data. However, I mean, as I think my talk today demonstrates, I think there are meaningful patterns in our data that we can overlook if we are sticking with that, very arbitrary threshold of significance. And so I think there are a lot of studies that have potentially found something interesting and that they should consider discussing, but they choose not to discuss it, or they choose to think it's not useful or interesting information simply because they don't necessarily reach that p-value of 0.05. So short answer, I think p-values are helpful, but we've seen in a variety of different studies in living populations that they might be pushing us to only identify certain patterns and not others. Particularly in studies like bioarchaeology that have very small sample sizes, you are less likely to identify a significant effect in those small samples. So we come up with these fantastic bioarchaeological studies, and we keep saying, oh, well, my work wasn't significant, my work doesn't matter because of that p-value. When it does, we just might not be detecting an effect simply because of the limitations of the data we're working with. So.
The question addressed. All right. Other folks? I have a question then. Mine is going to be a very presentist and probably a very US-centric question, so you can go ahead and stop me if that's the case. But I was just curious if there's any indication from the sample sizes that you have or what you know about those historic populations. Is there any sense of the ethnic makeup of those communities? I assume 1750s to 1850s England, it probably doesn't make sense to track race because I assume they're pretty racially homogeneous populations, but correct me if I'm wrong about that. But is there any sense of, are these especially for the low status individuals that are experiencing these higher rates of morbidity or disease. Is there any indication of that?
Yeah, so there actually haven't been many studies on this because I think particularly in the US and the UK right now, race is a bit of a touchy subject to participate in those conversations, which perhaps makes it even more important. But they are not homogenous based on the studies that have been conducted to date, even in slightly more distant temporal periods. So even in the medieval period, we know that there are individuals of other ethnic backgrounds in England, particularly in those urban centers, whether they're there voluntarily or not. So we are almost certainly, in studies like mine, overlooking some important aspects of variation simply because we don't take that data down. And I, for example, did not take down any information on ethnic background of the people I was looking at and just assumed that that would not be one of the relevant categories in my data. And that might have been an invalid assumption on my part because we do know that there are other backgrounds there.
And did you ever said, like, at that point, I mean, everything I know about England comes from American Werewolf in London and US history. So like after late 1600s in the US, like British stopped relying so much on forcibly imported indentured Irish and Scottish labor. Is there any, would the assumption be that maybe it's the descendant populations of those groups who are finding work in industrialized England, or are folks coming from even further beyond like the British Isles?
Potentially. So we are, as far as I know, there are a hefty number of people coming from Ireland and Scotland into England at this point. Particularly some of your younger adult individuals are coming from those areas. We have a few individuals coming from a little further afield, but it is not in large quantities as far as I know.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other folks?
I have a general question. When you were showing us your populations or your samples, the high status individuals all basically came from one cemetery. Is that typical? The higher status folks were buried separately?
So yes, one of the main things that's determining where people of different statuses are buried is the cost of particular cemeteries. And we have quite a few different cemeteries of varying socioeconomic status coming from England. Usually the main factor is the type of burial that they're in. So individuals of lower socioeconomic status could only afford burials relatively far away from the church and in earth-cut graves. In contrast, your wealthy individuals could afford burials either inside the church itself, which was very expensive, or in some sort of family vault. So we do have a few cases, for example, Christ Church, Spitalfield also has some vaults and crypts that have individuals of high status. But a lot of the cemeteries that are accepting people from kind of the general populace are going to be a little bit further from the church and in some cases completely unassociated with the church. So for example, the New Bun Hill Fields collection, this was largely composed of nonconformist individuals, so people who didn't conform to the Church of England in terms of beliefs and burial practices. And so this was a huge kind of concentration of people who either couldn't afford burial in a church or didn't want to be buried in a church. Whereas when we look at some of these crypt populations like the St. Bride's, Fleet Street crypts, those are entirely composed of people who could just afford it.
Thank you.
Thank you for speaking today. So this approach and its sister approaches within intersectional studies rely a lot on historical documentation. How would you plan to reconcile that as you go further back in time, or go to a different context that doesn't have that written historical documentation?
Or
So
can
glad.
you?
So I am currently working with a couple populations from Ottoman era Hungary. So this is the 16th and 17th centuries. We do have some limited historical documents, but they're all written in Old Ottoman Turkish, which is, a handful of people in the world can actually speak and read that. It's not the same as modern Turkish. So we don't have historical documents that we can necessarily rely on to get some of this rich descriptive information. So I'm actually being pushed into this situation right now. And one of the things that I am doing, one of the things that Dr. Knudsen has been doing with her study of populations in northern Chile has been to look at other factors that might give us some indication about identity or community membership beyond just what documents tell us. So for example, in Knudsen's studies, they looked at artificial cranial deformation. So the shape of the head was frequently used to convey certain identities or statuses to people. And so you could actually look at how their experiences varied across different groups based on head shape, basically. On my end of things, we don't have anything like cranial deformation. So what I have been using has been archaeological evidence. We have occasional grave goods that are being included in some of these samples that tell us a little bit about the religious community, for example, that someone is coming from, or the type of lifestyle that they're participating in compared to another community. So for example, I have a great deal of individuals who were associated with the Ottoman military, but some of them were kind of high up members of the military and they lived in the cities. It was very cushy and well protected. And then some other members of the military were just kind of, they weren't fully enlisted, but they were kind of like auxiliary members of the military. And they lived outside of the city walls, right on the borders of the empire. They had a totally different community membership and totally different experiences beyond what we see in some of these higher up members of the military. So using some of these archaeological indicators of the communities that people are coming from is the main way that I think intersectional studies are going to get some of that information that they can't access in written documents.
Good answer.
Thank you.
I think we have enough time for me to squeeze in one more question, if anybody has one. Yeah.
Good afternoon and thank you. I'd like to know, what are the potential modern day applications of your field of study findings? What modern industries might utilize the information that you're gathering and how could it be applied?
I think that answer certainly connects us back to kind of the reasoning for intersectionality in the first place, which it was built in the context of social activism. And I think the opportunity we have as bioarchaeologists working in the past is to start engaging in these conversations about how cultural context is impacting some of these patterns of health and mortality that we're seeing. We can also look at, how distantly do some of these things go back in time? Do we have evidence that some of these intersectional relationships that we see in living populations were also existing or were also relevant back in the past? And if they weren't, then we know that came from somewhere, and we can look at kind of the origin of some of these relationships and potentially dismantle them. Excuse me. So I think one of the key things that we can offer to the conversation is, how do we dismantle or minimize and mitigate some of these inequities that exist in the present day? And how can we use the past to kind of inform some of those approaches? So I think certainly in epidemiology, in public health, we can denaturalize some of these inequalities that we've come to see as just, a fact of life. And we can say, no, they didn't exist in the past. Here's what we could potentially change to improve those things. I think that was certainly true in the COVID-19 pandemic, where we identified some of these important intersections among different identity categories that were experiencing inequality in the patterns of mortality existing among those groups compared to others. And so I think adding to that conversation this perspective from the past, and that we can change things, could be a great deal of help to fields like epidemiology and public health that work with these living groups.
It's a fantastic question and answer to end on. So I think we'll go ahead and provide another round of applause for that. Appreciate it. Yeah, and we'll be back again. For those of you here, we'll be back again next week for more talks, I think. Yeah, something like that. Thank you, Dr. Yaussy.
Great. Thank you so much.